Well, it's such an honor to be with you this morning, and it's always a treat to be with friends from the other Nobel Peace Prize foundations. Today, I'm really going to share how the Desmond and Leah Tutu Legacy Foundation thinks about peace building, and particularly reflects on the story of South Africa as one that gives us some insight into what we need to be doing as we try to reach for peace. I recently came across a new acronym called BANI, B-A-N-I, as a description for the world. It is that the world is currently brittle, anxious, non-linear, and incomprehensible. And that is certainly what it feels like. It's in the context of this BANI world that peace is deeply under threat, but also in which there might be opportunities to shift relationships and do things differently. Today we're gathered here not just to speak about peace as an abstract ideal, but to commit ourselves to its practice. Peace is a living, breathing force that must be nurtured in every corner of our fractured world. In working with friends in a global Emerging Peace Builders program, we've been speaking about how we create healing points in a broken world. I do hope that today your conversations and the gathering will be one of those healing points. Obviously, we are guided by the legacy of Archbishop Desmond Tutu in our work. If you hear me refer to him as the Arch, that's what South Africans call him, so I forgive the nickname. His life was a testament to the power of radical love, of unyielding truth, and unshakable belief in the possibility that we might one day find each other across our divides. One of the greatest challenges the Arch gave us was his quote that if you want peace, you don't talk to your friends, you talk to your enemies. While we speak frequently of building peace, it is rare for us to actually engage across lines of deep division. For many of us, those that show up in our dialogue spaces already come from somewhat of a similar position. That's why in our work, as we try to build these spaces for conversation and dialogue across divides, we talk of needing to grow the courage to heal. Courage is rooted in community and solidarity. It's rooted in being able to see that change is possible. It's rooted in a radical reconceptualization of what we accept as normal. And it asks of us to take a risk, to hope for the possibility of change. In our work to grow society's courage to heal, we draw on 3 examples of work from Archbishop Desmond Tutu. The first was his commitment to reconciliation. And for us, reconciliation is the very hard work of keeping on trying to find each other. There's a fantastic book by a University of Cape Town professor of psychology, Wabi Long, which is called Nation on the Couch, which gives a psychological analysis of South Africa. And he diagnoses that our major state of being in South Africa is a state of alienation from each other. And that the way we overcome this is by keeping on trying to find each other. That we have to become more human to each other. We have to find ways to connect across all of these divides, structural and identity and all others. So while South Africa's formal negotiations, of which F.W. de Klerk was such an important part, took place in the early 1990s, it was preceded by multiple forms of other dialogue. Dialogue between enemies, dialogue between business and liberation movements, talks about talks. There was always a dialogue happening in some way, shape, or form that allowed us to get to the point of actually having the formal negotiations. That is the work of keeping on trying to find each other. And that is also the work of rehumanizing each other. The Arch once said that one of the most important things about South Africa's negotiations was that the negotiators became more human to each other. Rolf Meyer and Cyril Ramaphosa realized they both loved fly fishing and spending time in the outdoors. And so the negotiations started to build an architecture of humanization through which negotiators could get to the point around the table of effective collective deliberation. When I think about the Arch's legacy, one of the hardest parts of it, I find personally, is His extraordinary capacity to speak truth to power forthrightly with righteous indignation, and to hold the humanity of every single person, including the perpetrator, as sacred at all times. It's a very tough thing to get right. Well, it's a very tough thing to try and do. But that is what is required of us, to open new ways of being and seeing each other. The second piece of work we take from his legacy is the importance of the work of repair. And often reparations are only thought of through a financial lens, and financial compensation may well be a very important tool. But repair is more about tackling every injustice, every discrimination, every oppression that continues, and changing the status quo. In South Africa, the adoption of our 1996 constitution was a profound moment of repair. It was a rehumanizing of Black and white South Africans. It was a commitment to a just society. But we know, as Christo and Nomhle both pointed out, that much has not been repaired. Inequality in South Africa is stubbornly extreme. We've seen how hard it is to fundamentally reshape dynamics of oppression and exploitation that were shaped by the colonial and apartheid regimes. And as John mentioned, I spent most of my career working on questions of youth unemployment and of young needs. And it is an incredibly stubborn thing to shift in a society in which there's been decades and decades of underinvestment in the human potential of the majority of the population. Finally, what the Arch taught us was that we need to be able to reimagine ourselves and our society. You know, when he stood in front of a crowd of 30,000 people on the Grand Parade in 1989, and he said to us, "Look at us. We are the rainbow people. We are the new people of a new nation." He was dreaming us into being. He was imagining, even at the height of the logic of separation, that there's a version of this country in which we are together, in which we can be together. And even in the creation of the Constitution, our constitutional drafters had to imagine a fundamentally different society. I personally am so grateful that as a queer woman, I live in the only country on the continent to support the rights of people of LGBTQIA community. And it's an example that shows that when they negotiated, they didn't negotiate for the minimum. We negotiated for a positive vision of what a just society could be for every single human being. And as Christo mentioned, as there are ongoing conversations about having a national dialogue in South Africa, it's my strong feeling that it mustn't simply be a process of identifying the problems we have. We know what those are. But it must be a process of building a shared imagination of who we can be together and where we're going. Much of this work can only take place in dialogue across divides. One example of South Africa's history in which we tried to find each other was the creation of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. The TRC was promulgated in 1995, so we're celebrating its 30th anniversary this year, and it was chaired by Archbishop Tutu. The TRC was an interesting beast that came out of the negotiations for our transition to democracy. And it really came out of the question of what do we do with the brutality and the violence that we've experienced as a society. At the time, there were two camps. One which wanted Nuremberg-style trials, put all the perpetrators on trial, face real justice. On the other hand, the idea of blanket amnesty. Everyone gets off, no court cases, no prosecutions. You can imagine who was on which side of that debate. But it was the genius of our dialogue, of our conversations with each other, that got us to the creation of the TRC, a fundamentally different approach. The TRC was a process in which we could create a moment of collective bearing of witness to the atrocities that have wounded and scarred our people, and a process in which it would be possible for perpetrators to get amnesty if they came forward, if they could prove their crimes were politically motivated, and if it was determined that they had told the whole truth. The TRC was a product of compromise in this way, but it set a very interesting precedent that many other truth commissions haven't followed. It dealt with all political violence, the political violence of the apartheid regime and violence that took place in the liberation movements or took place from right-wing armed groups. That is an astonishing thing for our negotiators to have come to, a point in which there wasn't a victor's justice system, in which we really sought to find each other through that process. In many ways, the TRC was a very important act of remembering. As a younger person, a child at the time, I can vividly remember watching the hearings on television in the weekly TRC reports, which stick in my mind so powerfully and were such an important part of the transition of all of us from a military regime into a democracy. But the TRC has also been in some ways a tool of amnesia. For instance, of the roughly 3,000 applications for amnesty that were made to the Commission, only 293 came from the apartheid forces. The vast majority came from the liberation movements. And so a particular process that had been set up to deal with these atrocities ultimately didn't have people come forward and participate in that process effectively. Largely, they felt that prosecution was unlikely because they destroyed so much evidence, and they felt that so few people had come forward that it was unlikely you would be implicated. We missed a big opportunity in this. We missed a really big opportunity in this. To reflect and share the stories, not just of the harms that were caused to Black South Africans, but the dehumanizing harms that white South Africans made and did. I often think, I'm not that young anymore, but as a youngish white South African, of how little conversation there is about the wounds of our parents, about the generations of young white men forced to carry arms and persecute young Black men. The actions of dehumanizing others that ultimately dehumanized ourselves too. And in the TRC's identification of 22,000 official victims of gross human rights violations, there were hundreds of thousands of people who didn't have access in that moment of the short 2 years of the Commission to submit their testimonies and be recognized. That lack of recognition of people's stories is a burden that is still carried and is something we really need to commit ourselves to doing. And in terms of justice, of roughly 300 cases handed over to the National Prosecuting Authority, only one was ever fully prosecuted. There are now about 150 cases that have been reopened, and just this last week, the Joburg High Court found that because it was a crime against humanity, there's no statute of limitations on prosecuting cases of apartheid crimes. And we know that the Luthuli family have brought an inquest into Chief Albert Luthuli's untimely death. So important and so challenging that it's 60 years later. So I view this not as a failure of the TRC itself, but the failure of our society to take the momentum of the TRC forward and create an ongoing platform for telling our stories, for sharing our fears and regrets, for coming to know each other better. This is still what we need to do to build positive peace in South Africa. We need to tell our stories. We need to hear each other's pain and fears. We need to remind ourselves that sustainable peace is not built on silence, it's built on truth, on the courage to confront painful histories while holding fast to the real possibility of a shared future. As the Arch pointed out, it's not an easy process. He said true reconciliation exposes the awfulness, the abuse, the hurt, the truth. It could even sometimes make things worse. It's a risky undertaking, but in the end it is worthwhile, because in the end only an honest confrontation with reality can bring real healing. Superficial reconciliation can only bring superficial healing. In this, he shows us that his legacy is about a peace that is not passive. It's a peace that stands in front of conflict and says there is another way. And that other way requires us to engage with each other. Dialogue is not easy. It demands vulnerability, humility, and courage. It asks us to listen to those we fear and despise, to humanize those we despise, and to seek understanding where we have only seen opposition before. But history shows us that no lasting peace has ever been built without dialogue. In today's world, torn apart by war and climate injustice, rising authoritarianism and deep inequality, dialogue must be reclaimed as a radical act of defiance against the logic of polarization. While dialogue can be dismissed as a simple talk shop, true dialogue, deep engagement on the frontiers of our divides is not just about talking, it is about transforming relationships. It is about rehumanizing each other and building a common purpose moving forward. Dialogue that transforms, we think in our work, must have at least 3 key characteristics. We must be able to tell each other our stories. It is when we share what's deep in our hearts, what is deep in our dreams, as well as in our fears, that where there may be the possibility of deeper discord at first, ultimately we will come to know each other as full human beings. Dialogue must risk the discomfort of having different perspectives in the room. The current fault lines, for instance, around Afrikaner identity in South Africa and the deep sense of threat that many Afrikaners carry, it should not be dismissed out of hand. Maybe just to make a note on the record, there's no basis for reality of any of the claims of white genocide or specific discrimination. But there's a fear there that's important to engage with, not to dismiss. And it's important to engage with it without shaming and humiliating people for the lived experiences that are contributing to the feeling that they don't have a place in this country. One of my great sadnesses as a white South African is that there are so few prominent white leaders in this country that have shown white South Africans how to be part of the new South Africa, how to be part of the society that we're building, rather than to separate. It's my deep wish that AfriForum could transform itself into a powerful organization, bringing connection, love, and dialogue, and a vision of our common shared humanity, rather than a vision of a Volksstaat or a division. And dialogue must be rooted in hope. As the Arch said, to choose hope is to step firmly forward into the howling wind, bearing your chest to the elements, knowing that the storm will pass. Hope is risky, unlike cynicism or despair, which I think too often in South Africa we fall into, because cynicism and despair require nothing of us. But hope means we might end up with a broken heart. But it's only through hope that we can dream beyond the status quo. Each of us here is a custodian of peace, whether we lead governments, organizations, grassroots movements, Rotary clubs. We must act urgently with a sense of love. We must find ways to talk and find each other across the divides we may mistake for normal. I think particularly of the US and how hard finding each other is in a moment like this. At the Foundation, we bring this kind of thinking into our work that we do. With children, we bring about 6,000 children to the Foundation, and through workshops on democracy, active citizenship, and leadership. We have a program called Leading for Humanity, where we're really trying to put courage and compassion and that wonderful South African thing of Ubuntu, that is our collective shared humanity, at the heart of leadership. And we try to practice dialogue, deep, scary, risky dialogue. We don't need to be perfect to be peacemakers. We can show up as the flawed human beings that we are, with our fears, with our dreams, with our hearts. We only need to be truly present. So as I conclude, let me share with you a blessing in the spirit of the Arch. May we be restless for justice. May we be bold in compassion. May we be tireless in truth. And may we never doubt that peace is possible, because we have seen it in the lives of so many that have gone before, who dared to dream it into being. Thank you so much.